We want to. I'm Barry Bluestone. I'm the director of the Dukakis Center and was the founding dean of our School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, who sponsors this open classroom. I see many of you as old friends who have been with us since our very first class in the spring of 2008. And this has been something we've done every semester. I think you're going to find that this is a very, very special class that we have this fall, an issue that I have been wanting to tackle for some time because there are no good answers. And we are going to be looking at big questions. We're going to look at lots of different kinds of answers from many different perspectives. So we are going to be taking a look at this whole question of justice. What is right and why, the moral foundations of public policy, and we're going to be looking at all these kinds of issues. Fairness, fair, what's just? What do we mean by equity versus equality? What do we mean by opportunity, community? So we are going to cover stuff from every different perspective, from philosophers to economists to political scientists to lawyers to people who practice international relations. It's going to be a great semester. But to get us started, I wanted to have my dear friend Matthias Ruth, who's interim director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, share a few comments with you. Matthias Ruth.
Well, thanks to all of you for being here. I want to also thank Barry for organizing this event. I want to start us off with a quote by one of the biggest 20th century philosophers, Yogi Berra, who once said that in theory there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And you'll find that what we do here at the Policy School, what we do through the open classroom is really live this tension between the theoretical knowledge, the accumulation of wisdom over long periods of time, and the pressing problems of today that we need to address given that context. So I look very much forward to, even if it's not the right or the best answers, at least to get the second best answers out of this semester. I want to welcome you to the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, to the Open Classroom, and to Northeastern in general. I hope you find this as an exciting place as I do, as many of our students, all of our students, I like to think, do, and hope that we will have, in the course of these open classroom discussions, lots of exchange and hear from you, as well as the keynote and panel speakers that we have throughout the semester. So many thanks to all of you, especially Barry and all of the guests that we will welcome here throughout the semester, and especially this evening.
You're going to see, running around here, I think he just went to get some water for everybody, Brian Young. Brian is a graduate assistant here who's been helping me plan all of this, and you're going to have a chance to meet him. He's done a yeoman's job, and if in fact all this electronics actually works, which would be the first time in my life this has ever happened, it's going to be because of Brian. 2 years ago, through the wonderful beneficence of Robert Beale, our dear friend, and who is the chair of the external board, advisory board of the School of Public Policy, we were able to endow this in the name of one of the most wonderful people who has ever lived in the Boston area, Myra Kraft. And as you'll learn from Robert in a few minutes, and I had a chance to work with Myra on a number of occasions, there was probably nobody in this city, nobody in the Commonwealth, and very few people in the nation or the world who touched more people than Myra did in her work on so many wonderful philanthropic endeavors. So we decided, with Robert's help, to name the Open Classroom forevermore as the Myra Kraft Open Classroom. And of course, we've done classrooms that some of you have been on, policy advice to the president, or the 21st century, or the semester we did on water or food policy. But I couldn't think of any subject that would have warmed Myra's heart more than to look at the issue of justice and to give us a little remembrance of who this absolutely wonderful person was. I want to bring up Robert Beale. This is our beloved Myra.
Barry, thank you, and it has been a pleasure to chair the School of Public Social Policy at Northeastern, and also be so involved with the Dukakis Center. The nice thing, going back in time, Michael grew up down the street from me, and at the age of 5, he taught me how to ride a bicycle. And hopefully I'll still try to ride a bicycle every now and then. And Michael, will you forgive me for wearing a tie tonight? Because when Michael teaches out at UCLA, I have Michael and Kitty come over in Los Angeles to dinner, and Michael will always look at me, Robert, you're in Los Angeles, take that goddamn tie off. So you'll forgive me, unless you want the tie. But
Michael has two. I've seen both of them.
I think I got him one once. But going back, Myra and her husband, we grew up together. Myra lived in Worcester. Robert Kraft grew up around the corner from where Michael and I lived in Brookline. And Myra and I became very, very close friends and involved. And her outreach civically, philanthropically, she was at Brandeis. When she graduated, she became very philanthropically involved, and they married. She went to Brandeis, Robert went to Columbia, and in 1963, when they graduated, they got married. And what was so wonderful philanthropically, she became the first chair of the Boys and Girls Club of Boston, and the first woman chair, and she went on to do so many other things. And philanthropically, Josh Kraft, her son, now chairs the boy, is the CEO of the Boys and Girls Club, and is doing a fabulous job. Myra's other activities relate to her succeeding me as the chair of the Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Greater Boston. She did a wonderful, wonderful job there. And then I suggested in 2009 that she become the chair of the United Way of Boston, and again, did a fabulous job doing that. And what Myra and I did, getting together, talking about where Boston was in 2005 when she succeeded me and became involved with the Jewish philanthropies, I said we should bring together the 4 major philanthropies in Boston, the Boston Foundation, the United Way, Catholic Charities, and the Jewish philanthropies, to focus on how we improve education in the school level in Boston. And we established something called the Educational Opportunity Agenda, which has done a fabulous job in outreaching and helping young students continue, learn, and move on, and not drop out of school. And her philanthropy of so many millions and millions of dollars has made such a difference in Boston. And Barry and I talked and said that it would be wonderful to name this series in her honor and her memory. And thank all of you.
That's Robert and Myra, and we are very fortunate to have Ed Fraioli, who's worked with the family for a long time in the Kraft Group, to make a few remarks on behalf of the family. Ed?
Good evening. On behalf of Robert Kraft, who is hunkered down this week getting ready for the first season game, go Patriots, he extends his warmest greetings to all of you. He sends special thanks to the university, Professor Bluestone's leadership, and especially to Robert Beal's generous support of this program. You know, Myra held many values close, but two key values of hers were openness to education and a mission of the school that was serving the community. And this program's perfect for that. And she would be so proud to be associated with a program on justice. So we really appreciate the distinguished panel's focus on the justice topic, and we look forward to their insights and observations. Thank you.
So we get started, and what I want to do is, first of all, introduce my colleagues who will be convening and lecturing here. Professor Dukakis, over here. Daniel Medwed from our law school. Paola Cesarini, who is the director of our honors program and is teaching the honors seminar that goes along with this. And Kevin Murphy, also from Kevin Murray from our law school, who works on issues of international justice. You'll hear from all of them, as well as other faculty, some of whom are in this room and will be lecturing to you over the next few weeks. So let's just take a look at what we're going to be doing. Today, very quickly, we're going to introduce the topic of justice, public policy, and law. You're going to hear from each of our conveners giving their own perspective on justice. We then, next week, will have both Ron Sandler and Steve Nathanson from our philosophy department asking the very, very broad question, what is just? What is fair? Looking at old and new theories of justice that philosophers have talked about. And Steve Nathanson, who's right here, my friend Steve, will join me on September 17th looking at theories of economic justice. We're going to go behind the veil of ignorance for part of the class and think about what gives us a foundation for thinking of what's just and unjust. And then on September 24th, we have a series of lectures that will be led by my friend Professor Medwed on criminal justice. And we're going to look at how how critical is innocence in criminal justice. And in the following week, Professor Medwed will be joined by Professor Cassidy of the Boston College Law School and my dear friend Diane Juilliard, former public defender and former deputy Middlesex district attorney and former deputy attorney general in the state, to discuss this whole question of procedural justice and what's guilt and what's innocence. And following that, Professor Medwed and Jeannie Salk of Harvard's Law School will be looking at the whole question of domestic violence and the role of the justice system in that. Following that, we are going to take a look not at criminal justice, but at civil justice. We're going to look at torts. We're going to look at who sues whom, who can sue whom. And we're going to take a look at whether there's fairness and equity in all of that. And then for 2 weeks, we're going to be taking a look at economic justice through the eyes of economists, if you will. I will be joined by my newest colleague here at the School of Public Policy, Alicia Sasser-Mondesino, who just joined our faculty of the School of Public Policy after serving for 7 years as one of the chief economists at the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, and my friend Arthur McEwen, who for almost 40 years has been teaching economics at UMass Boston, where I taught many, many years ago. We're going to look at who's responsible for the inequality expressed. And I'm particularly excited about this because I've actually been looking at the question of income inequality since the mid-'80s, when my late colleague Bennett Harrison of MIT and I wrote a series of papers and a book which looked at the great U-turn, the fact that we've been growing toward a faster growing economy with greater equality through 1973 from the end of World War II, and then we saw one indicator after another of growing inequality, slowing growth, growing poverty, and so forth. And there was a lot of discussion back then about, well, what's responsible for this? And most people, or most economists were saying, particularly at a conference I attended back in the 1980s at the Federal Reserve Bank, it's all about education and technological change. And I said, well, you know, I think it's probably more than that. And I had just read Agatha Christie's murder mystery, Murder on the Orient Express. And if you read that, you know there were many suspects. And I said, let's take a look at all of them. So I wrote an article which I asked that the title be Murder on the Inequality Express, but my editor was a little sheepish and dropped the word murder. Then, on the 29th, we're going to have a very special session here, because we're going to ask the question, okay, if you don't like inequality, if you think inequality is unjust, then that's still an open question, what can you do about it? And what can you do about the birth lottery, folks who grow up with a silver spoon in their mouth and those who do not? And joining me is going to be our very dear friend, Senator Dan Wolf, state senator who's been working on these issues. He's also the CEO of Cape Air, one of the fine airlines in the state. And then on November 5th, we hope to have Margaret Burnham from our law school and Jack McDevitt, who heads the Institute for Race and Justice here, on where are we on racial justice. And again, we put this all together before Ferguson, Missouri, and I'm sure we'll hear something about that. And then November 12th, we'll switch attention once again to another issue, environmental justice. Who bears the brunt of the Earth's degradation? And we have my dear colleague Dan Faber from the Sociology Department and Veronica Eady, who is the chief researcher for the Conservation Law Foundation, going to lead that discussion for us. And then our last two classes, the last one before Thanksgiving, both our conveners, Kevin Murray and Paolo Cesarini, will lead us on a discussion of global justice. What's the 21st century agenda? We're going to look around the world. We're going to take a break for Thanksgiving, and then a very, very special evening, December 3rd, when Ambassador Nick Burns, formerly Ambassador to Greece, Ambassador to NATO, and Deputy Secretary of State under Condoleezza Rice, now at the Kennedy School, will be leading us in a very, very special presentation that he is going to write specially for us on what role for the U.S. in pursuing global justice. And he's going to be asking the very fascinating question of what do you do when national security and international justice clash? Stay tuned. So what I want to do before we take a little break is have each of our conveners give us 6 or 7 or 8 minutes of their own advice, their own thoughts about justice. And we'll start with our dear friend, Governor Michael Dukakis.
So, how are you? Good. This is terrific. I thought I might begin by first taking a little issue with my dear friend on whether or not there are answers to this. Of course there are answers. At least if you're in politics, you assume there are going to be answers out there, and the job is to go in and find them. And I'd suggest, Barry, that I'm the oldest guy in the room, right? Anybody older than I am? Who's older than I am? How old?
82.
Barely old. Barely older. Well, anyone else? 80, 81, 82? Anyone 80s? 89. Right.
By the way, he has been with us since the first open classroom.
Well, I thought, Barry, it might be helpful to set the stage by talking rather positively about what's happened to justice, at least during my lifetime. Because in many, many ways, we've come miles in this country in developing our concepts of justice and implementing those concepts. Let me tell you about the Boston that Kitty and I grew up in. And I'm delighted that the First Lady is here and continues to be Medicare's best advertisement in the United States of America. I grew up in 33. I was born in 33. Kitty was born in 1936. We were Depression babies. Boston and the nation were racist, They were anti-Semitic. The gap between rich and poor was enormous. When Kitty and I graduated from Brookline High School, over half the kids in this country never made it through high school. Back in the old days when everybody did so well in wonderful schools, nobody got pregnant, life was terrific. Infant mortality was 5 times what it is today. And folks arrested by the police in many, many communities in this country regularly were taken to the back of the police station and beat up. Confessions were coerced on a regular basis. And God forbid you were a person of color. In just about every part of the country, and especially in the South. In fact, I first met Antonin Scalia, who was my classmate at Harvard Law School, in our 3rd year. In those years, you were assigned to one of 3 sections, and you went to the same classes with those folks for 2 years. So you got to know the folks in your section, you got to know people in your moot court club, but you didn't know anyone else. It wasn't until my 3rd year that I took a course called Federal Courts and Federal Jurisdiction with a great man named Henry Hart. He's kind of the national expert on the subject. And from the get-go, there was this guy who insisted on engaging Professor Hart every single day in long dialogues because he was extremely concerned about the fact that increasingly, this is in 1960, folks, the Civil Rights Revolution, federal courts were stepping into state courts, especially in the South, though not exclusively, and taking cases away from those courts because they had come to the conclusion that if you were a person of color and a criminal defendant, at least in those states, forget it. And Scalia was troubled by this. He said, what would this do to the delicate balance between the federal and the state court systems? This went on for about 3 weeks. I hadn't had the benefit of Mike Sandel's course. Finally turned to the guy next to me and I said, who the hell is that guy? He said, he's Scalia. He's on the Law Review. And I said to him, does he know what it's like to be black in the South? Of course, I could have said, does he know what it's like to be black anywhere? Because people of color didn't live in the town of Brookline or in the city of Newton. In fact, they didn't live, folks, on this side of the railroad tracks. They might work here, they had to go back there to live and to go to bed. Jewish kids during World War II, in the middle of the Holocaust, were regularly beat up by Christian kids on Blue Hill Avenue every single day. And I don't remember anybody raising hell about it. And last year, when our grandson from Denver, who's one of the junior tennis champions of Denver, was here at the Longwood Cricket Club with his father playing the National Father and Sons tournament, Kitty tried to explain to him that when she was his age, she couldn't have stepped foot in the Longwood Cricket Club. And he simply could not understand. That was the world we grew up in, folks. We've made enormous progress since then. Thanks to a lot of things, people who got deeply engaged in this, gutsy lawyers who brought suits, judges who began making decisions. And I think it's unquestionable that we have come miles. First, in trying to define what we mean by justice, and secondly, taking the steps we've got to take to achieve kinds of standards for justice, particularly in the criminal justice system, that we now, I think, for the most part, are committed to, which does not mean that you don't have a Ferguson, and there are others around. But the folks who professionally do this work will tell you, and I used to be a lawyer back in my youth, it was many years ago, that we really have come, not miles, but light years in developing concepts of justice, especially in our justice system. And while it continues to be imperfect, and it has to be a work in progress all the time, I think we do ourselves an injustice, Barry, by not acknowledging the fact that there has been enormous progress in the justice system. So what is it about justice that bothers me these days? It's the economic side of things. That's the thing that concerns me. Barry and I and Kitty had the wonderful good fortune yesterday of being at the Great Fenway Writers Series, which is at Fenway Park and features writers, usually sports writers, but not always. And I had the great honor of introducing last night's key performer, who happens to be the senior United States Senator from Massachusetts these days, Elizabeth Warren, who talked about what it was like when her brothers had gone off to the military. Her dad became disabled and was able to work. She was the one remaining child at home, and her mother had to put on her best dress and go across the street to Sears and start working there for minimum wage. The point she made, though, was that at that time in the 1960s, the minimum wage still made it possible for a family of three to support itself. Today's minimum wage doesn't do that. And that's not the only justice issue. Here's a quote for you. Of all forms of injustice, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and the most inhumane. Who said that? Say again? I don't think so. Martin Luther King, interestingly enough. Martin Luther King. So it isn't that we should leave the justice system, the criminal justice system. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do. But I would suggest to you, as Barry already has, that the issue of economic injustice in all of its respects is one that we really have to focus on. Because we haven't done as well there. In point of fact, it seems to me it's getting worse. I hope that at least gives us a little perspective as we embark on this journey together. Thanks.
Spoken like a true lawyer. Our next convener is actually a new friend of mine who I have the highest regard for. This idea of the justice theme actually came about because last year Professor Medwed was the Klein Lecturer, and each year the university chooses just one professor to give this distinguished lecture. I was very fortunate to be asked to do it way back in 2005. And I had never met Professor Medwed, I'd never met Daniel, and I went to this lecture, and I was so mesmerized by not only the content, by the presentation. I turned to some of my friends and I said, this may have been the greatest lecture I've ever heard, and I've heard people like Martin Luther King and Jack Kennedy. I've read Abraham Lincoln. And he has thought more about these issues of justice than anyone I know, but also presents them in a way that just grabs you. Dan Medwed.
Well, Barry, you're so good at minimizing expectations. It's an absolute delight to be here. In particular, Governor Dukakis, I've been an admirer of you for many years. And your story about your classmate, Scalia, reminds me of an experience that I had. When I was in law school 20 years ago, there was a student, similar student, who kept pressing my con law professor about all of these issues, suggesting that affirmative action was ridiculous, that state intervention was problematic. And I did turn to my neighbor and I said, who is this guy? And the person turned to me and said, Medwed, you don't know Ted Cruz? So sadly, history does repeat itself, I guess. But in any event, the issue that I'm going to focus on as part of this wonderful occasion is criminal justice. Who do we punish? How do we punish? Why do we punish? And I'll begin with a brief story. Does the name Steve Avery mean anything to you? Any baseball fans in the room? Yes. Who's Steve Avery? Pitcher for the Atlanta Braves, circa 1991, 1992. This story is not about that Steve Avery. It's about another Steve Avery, who's famous for a very different reason. In 1985, a young woman named Penny Bernstein was jogging along Lake Michigan in a town called Two Rivers, Wisconsin, when a man sadly brutally raped her and assaulted her. The police had no suspects until Ms. Bernstein identified a local ne'er-do-well named Stephen Avery as the perpetrator. Stephen Avery had a pretty good alibi. He was at his parents' home in Green Bay that entire day, had several alibi witnesses. Nevertheless, based on this compelling eyewitness testimony, Mr. Avery was convicted of rape and assault in 1985 in Wisconsin State Court. I guess it's called Wisconsin State Court. And he was sentenced to 32 years in prison. 18 years later, after the work of the Wisconsin Innocence Project located several hairs from the perpetrator at the crime scene and subjected those hairs to DNA testing, Stephen was freed. Because the testing of those hairs revealed something very important. They did not come from Stephen Avery. Instead, they belonged to another man who lived in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, who was incarcerated for a different, similar rape and assault. To much fanfare, Stephen Avery was released in 2003, and he went back to his hometown, a small town right near Green Bay, to work at his family's auto salvage yard, the Avery Auto Salvage Yard. Stephen Avery sued the local county for millions of dollars and became something of a local celebrity. In fact, he was such a local celebrity that when the Wisconsin State Legislature proposed the passage of a slate of criminal justice reforms, they named those reforms the Avery Reforms. For 2 years, Mr. Avery basked in the glow of his somewhat unwanted but somewhat pleasing celebrity, and he worked at the salvage yard. A woman named Teresa Hallback in 2005 was a photographer for Auto Trader magazine and went to the auto salvage yard to take some photos. She'd been there 15 times before. But the 16th time was different. She never returned. Police investigated the case and subsequently determined that she had been murdered. Next to her corpse and in her car was a trail of blood. The blood was tested. The DNA profile was determined to be a match to Stephen Avery. He was subsequently convicted of murdering Miss Hallback. Was this justice? Consider this for a moment. An innocent man goes to prison for a vicious rape he did not commit. He spends 18 years in maximum security prison in Wisconsin. No cheese curds for him. 18 years before he's freed through the magic of DNA technology. The victim has no justice. The true perpetrator is not held accountable for his actions. But then upon his release, 2 years later, he commits an even worse sin, murdering somebody, another innocent. When you think about criminal justice, you think not just about who we punish, why we punish, how we punish, but you think about justice for whom? Whose justice? There's justice for the defendant. There's justice for the victim. There's justice for all of us. Because prosecutors don't represent victims. They represent the people of the jurisdiction, the people of the county in which you reside, the state in which you live. So when you think about criminal justice, you have to consider all of the constituencies. And that's what we'll do during our 3 sessions on criminal justice. First, I'll talk about some of my own work, which does focus on wrongful convictions and looks at a very, or at least I think it's interesting, or at least it's the issue that got me tenure a few years ago. I managed to fool at least my tenure committee, if not all of you. But the issue really is innocence a good thing? Is the focus on wrongful convictions and innocence, which I consider to be a great thing, One of the major developments in the past 25 years. August 14th, 2014 marked the 25th anniversary of the first exoneration through DNA testing, post-conviction DNA testing. It's one of the greatest developments in criminal justice of all time. But has this focus detracted from other forms of justice? What about the costs of emphasizing accuracy at the expense of other values? Is it truly just to let 10 guilty go free in order to ensure that one innocent doesn't remain behind bars? What about the costs to victims? What about the costs to public safety? What about the costs to all of us? The first session will look at those issues. The second session, as Barry pointed out, will look at procedural justice. To what extent should we exalt procedural protections, due process, the right to counsel, the right to the disclosure of evidence against you? To what extent should we exalt those values over other values? And last but not least, a little bit closer to home, does the calculus shift in the context of domestic violence, in the context of physical and sexual abuse against an intimate partner or a child? Does justice mean something else when the victim is within your own home? Those are some of the criminal justice issues we'll look at, and we will not look at Stephen Avery's curveball from Atlanta, 1992. Thank you very much.
You are in for a heck of a semester. Our third convener is Paola Cesarini, who is heading our honors program and who I have the honor of teaching our seminar with. Paola.
What a tough act to follow. If you count that I have an accent, then I really have my work cut out. Oh, okay. Wonderful. Can you hear me now? All right, so I'm a political scientist when I don't direct the honors program. And in political science, we talk about essentially contested concept. So my question to you is, what is international justice? What is international justice? What do you think it is? There are no right or wrong answers. Barry just said that. Wonderful. So international law, or at least international customary law. Anyone else? So issues of global fairness. What else?
Variations between countries and law.
Okay. So justice among nations or comparative constitutional systems.
The attempt to uphold and reinforce international law and international standards as opposed to being defined.
So supranational. How complicated, huh? Let me give you the definition by Amnesty International. According to this very illustrious organization, international justice is the cooperation among countries to hold accountable individuals accused of grave human rights abuses, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. I think that combine your answers go very close to this definition, but as the young lady here pointed out, international justice, especially in this day and age, seems to have a much broader concept than just civil and political rights. It seems to involve issues of global human security, such as, for example, arms control, disease control and prevention, environmental protection, to name a few. And also question of fairness, which my dear friend Kevin Murray will talk about in a moment. Okay, so we have a little bit of a grasp of what international justice is. Well, what international justice is not, I think actually is a key issue that we should focus our attention, especially in this country. International justice is not supranational justice. It's not the diagram that you see behind me. The only quasi-supranational justice system currently in place is that of the European Union, where myself as an Italian can sue the French government in front of the European Court of Human Rights for something that happened to me in Spain. But that is Europe. The Latin American human rights system is moving towards that direction, but it still has a long way to go. And certainly nowhere in Asia there is a system, a regional supranational system of justice. In short, we're light years away from Star Trek's fictional United Federation of Planets, which could be characterized as a world government. In fact, it is an interplanetary government where various planetary governments agree to exist semi-autonomously under a single central government based on the utopian principles of universal liberty, rights, and equality, and also agree to share their knowledge and resources in peaceful cooperation and space exploration. Live long and prosper. So realistically, an international system of justice on planet Earth would at best complement and reinforce national justice systems, not replace them. Why is that the case? I love to ask questions. Sorry. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. All right, thank you very much for that contribution. Anyone else? Well, the answer is because the international system is characterized by anarchy, which by definition, and Professor Lukakis will help me here because he's Greek, means the absence of government. So I have here the famous triptych of Bosch, which actually is called the Garden of Earthly Delights, but I like to think, whenever I look at this painting, it's actually on wood. It's very small. It's in the Museo del Prado in Madrid. I think that this is perfect for the three versions of anarchy that I am familiar with. One is sort of the anarchy that arises from perfection. So whether you're Christian, you believe in the Garden of Eden that God created, or you're Marxist, and you believe that eventually the revolution of the proletariat will lead to the superfluousness of government, anarchy can be defined as the absence of government because there's no need for it. We're all free and we're all getting along, including with the animals. In the middle, you have kind of what international system is right now, where you have everybody doing their thing, some people having a lot of fun, and some people having not so much fun. And essentially, always fun is those who have the resources to do it, and the power and the intellect to organize their activities in interesting fashion. And then the last part is sort of more the Hobbesian notion of anarchy, where the only way in which you can overcome the state of war of all against all is by creating a monstrous despot who's going to make sure that we don't kill each other anymore. And I think the Leviathan is that guy with the big dots there. Anyway, my art appreciation notwithstanding, the situation is that currently there exists no overarching power to legislate over the objection of states that collectively make up the system. Similarly, there is no overarching power to enforce even the international legislation that has already been agreed upon. There are only a group of states in this day and age that now and then agree to collectively act in order to redress breaches of international law. In short, the international system has no government, no army, no independent power of taxation, no permanent police, and only a handful of limited court-like institutions. It therefore lacks the main features that allow national states to administer justice. So, how can we talk about justice in international context when that context is characterized by anarchy and lacks the features that are essential in order to administer, at least the feature that we are familiar with when we think about states administering justice? Well, despite the anarchy actually something vaguely resembling a system of international and not supranational justice exists. In this system, however, as this old cartoon illustrates, I think it was published during the Second Iraq War under the Bush administration. In this system, however, relative power often determines outcomes. But let's look at what we have. And as Professor Dukakis pointed out, let's look on the bright side, right? So we do have a special set of socially constructed principles, rules, practices, and even a few judicial institutions that together make up this system of international justice. We have customary international law that is made largely of unwritten principles, but which derive their status as customary international law for the fact that states seem to keep respecting them. Think about the principle pacta sunt servanda, which in Latin means pacts must be obeyed or must be served literally. Or the emerging principle, although still very contested, so not certainly a reason to the level of customary international law, of universal jurisdiction, which says if someone commits heinous acts such as genocide, should have no quarter no matter where he or she escapes to, because national courts, thanks to Universal Declaration of Human Rights, will have the jurisdiction of punishing human rights abuses no matter where they were committed. We also have written declaration that although no binding treaties seem to have risen to the level of customary international law, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Lady also referred to. And then we have treaties and conventions which have the full weight of international law, though they have very thin enforcement. We have the Charter of the United Nations, first and foremost, with the Security Council legislation that is perhaps the strongest example of enforcement in the area of international law. Then we have the Statute of the International Criminal Court. We have the Geneva Conventions, which are some of the oldest examples of international law, and then we have regional treaties and conventions, which are terribly uneven, the European system being the strongest and the Asian system being the weakest. We also have interesting newcomers in the international justice system. We have these international hybrid tribunals. Think of the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia that are currently putting on trials the member of the Khmer Rouge regime. And these are hybrid tribunals because there's a lot of international cooperation and financing for them. Or the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia of Sierra Leone, or fact-finding bodies. We'll think about something like the Truth and Reconciliation of South Africa, which was largely a domestic exercise, but with a lot of international help, and many fact-finding bodies, especially in developing countries right now, are set up thanks to the United Nations system or financed through donors. So, does international justice matter? This is what Kevin and I essentially will talk about in the context of this course. Let me tell you what I think. I think it matters because an organized system of justice is a fundamental trait of civilized society. And as I like to call myself a global citizen, I'd like to be a citizen of a civilized society. More importantly, international justice acts as a deterrent for future abuse, warning perpetrators that they cannot evade justice by crossing borders. Also, international justice enables survivors anywhere in the world to obtain justice and reparations and to support post-conflict reconciliation. You don't have to take it from me. And the governor started with Martin Luther King. I'd like to end with Martin Luther King. This is what he said in a speech during the Vietnam War. We must engage in a positive thrust for democracy, realizing that our greatest defense against our enemies is to take offensive action on behalf of justice. We must, with positive action, seek to remove those conditions of poverty, insecurity, and injustice which are the fertile soil in which the seed of hatred grows and develops. Our enemies will never be defeated by the use of atomic bombs or other weapons. A positive revolution of values is our best defense. Such revolution of values means that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. It means that every nation must develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. If we do not act now, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, a strength without sight. So, in all of this, what are the key questions that we may expect to debate in the context of this course, the main questions about international justice? Well, the first thing that I would like you to start thinking about is the question of whether further expansion of the international justice system is either desirable or feasible in the current time. I also would like you to start thinking about the question of whether power and security consideration should always necessarily be at odds with international justice. In other words, do you think you need to be a naive idealist to believe that international justice is a good thing? And I'm sure that Ambassador Burns will share a lot of interesting insights on this question. The other questions I'm very interested in, and I know that Kevin is interested as well, is can or should non-governmental organizations or individuals advance international justice through their action? Or should their ability to succeed be strictly dependent on whether states and international organizations support them? And finally, I would like you to think about a question that's very close to my heart, which is, should international justice play a role in redressing historical injustices? Things such as colonialism, slavery, pollution, etc. So, international justice, as you can see from the cartoon there, it's still a long way from being the efficient machine that domestic justice is, at least in advanced Western countries. And yet, as we just heard from Professor Medved, sometimes we complain a lot about our justice systems in Western countries because there are problems with it. So let's think about these two systems together and let's figure out how they talk to each other and eventually how we can all be better off by using them and making sure they prosper. Thank you.
finally, we have our last convener, Kevin.
Good evening. Thanks, Barry, for putting this together. Really exciting event to be part of. Really exciting to be here with all of you. I've worked for many years in the international NGO community, and certainly at this moment what we would do now is have everybody get up and spin around, but we're going to wait a few minutes to do that. You'll have a chance to spin in just about 5 minutes. My name is, as Barry said, is Kevin Murray. I'm the Executive Director of the Program on Human Rights in the Global Economy at the law school. The program is much better known as FERGI, and I want to tell you two of the many unique things about FERGI. One is it's the only human rights program in the universe that's named after a member of the Black Eyed Peas. That's the most unique thing about it. And the second unique thing about it is that Northeastern has the honor of having the only law school-based human rights program in the United States that's focused on what we consider to be the neglected stepchildren of the human rights enterprise, which are economic, social, and cultural rights. We could go on, we could have a rich discussion about why there are so many such centers outside of the United States, but only one here in this country. We're happy to share with Dr. Cesarini the happy task of injecting global sensibility in some form into our discussion about justice. Global justice, I think as the governor said, we have come many miles, but we have many more miles to go. What is global justice? We know something is wrong, something is terribly wrong, but how are we going to get a handle on it? What do we know? We know that over 20% of the world's population subsists on $1 per day. And we also know that another 23%, according to the United Nations, subsists on just $1 more per day. That's not a dollar, but it's inflation. We struggle to understand how this is possible, but we don't confuse it with global justice. It's by now old news that one country on Earth is home to less than 6% of the world's population, but its lucky inhabitants consume close to 25% of the world's resources, the world's non-renewable resources. We know firsthand how that's possible, but dare we call it just? Assuming that human actions are causing global temperatures to rise, what global institutions will rise up to act to ensure that those living on that single dollar will not bear the brunt of the catastrophe to come? Will it be a global justice system that rises up to do that? We've been many miles, but we have many more miles to go. Fergie explores social problems through a human rights lens with special attention to ESC rights. These ESC rights are late into the human rights game. They really only began to be talked about as part of the human rights discourse early in the 20th century, and only became really legitimate with their inclusion in what was mentioned before as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when we talk about ESC rights, we're talking about the right to housing, the right to water. These are internationally recognized rights with their roots in international law. They're also, in addition to being late into the game, these are tricky rights. Unlike the so-called first-generation civil and political rights, these rights often require positive action by government in order to be implemented. So it's not enough to implement the right to education just to control your security forces. You have to somehow find resources, take positive action to build schools, to train teachers, etc. So ESC rights often require positive action. Very decided steps on the part of government. But they're even trickier for another reason. And that reason is because increasingly, as economic globalization assumes new forms, the fulfillment or denial of these ESC rights is dependent not just on actions by governments, but also on the actions of non-state actors operating on a global scale. Where's the system of global justice to bring about the just outcomes on the global stage? This takes us right to the biggest problem that global justice faces. And there's an analyst that says it so perfectly, I'm just going to read you a couple sentences of it. And what she says is the very terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights pose an obstacle to global justice. The Declaration circumscribes the individuals, especially the migrants' rights to travel, work, etc., by the boundaries of the state, by citizenship, and it supposes that the state is the primary agent responsible for implementing those rights. Right? So the state both holds the obligation and also holds the responsibility to make sure that the obligation is implemented. This is the 21st century problem faced by anybody like myself who's interested in human rights. So what to do? As Professor Cesarini mentioned, there are no overarching global institutions that can coerce or obligate states to implement human rights. So what are we going to do? You can see where this is going, right? Just like Dr. Cesarini said. If you want global justice, you need global government, right? You need some kind of global government. And when I say that, I expect the guys with the night vision glasses to come through the back door and start lecturing me about black helicopters and the dangers of global government. I want to go back just to the analyst that I quoted before to talk a little bit about her response to this idea that we need global government in order to have global justice. She anticipated our question and she said, this does not mean necessarily a global government. It can also mean state or bounded local institutions that adopt a cosmopolitan scope of responsibility for understanding the global roots of disparities. And she uses the example of the Unocal Oil Company case in 1997, in which a very bounded California court extended federal jurisdiction to hold a private investor potentially responsible for human rights violations in a distant place, Burma. So her name, and this analyst, I should say, by the way, her name is Christine Jones-Pauly, and she's a British expert in international law. And what she is asking us to do, and I'm asking us to do as part of our conversation here, is to envision a system of global justice that's probably made up of some new kinds of international institutions, alongside national judicial institutions ready to wake up and smell the coffee, ready to understand that we're in a global world where the demands of global justice are different. We must face new challenges. I'm told that if you look closely enough, if you look out over the horizon carefully, you can see such a system emerging. Perhaps in the course of our conversation, we'll see if we can see that or find that system. Thank you.